and it's been a magical blur. So much has happened in such a short amount of time that it's been difficult with me keeping up with it all. The most important of which is that I'm now under some heavy Saturn and Mars transits. So what better time than to start getting into this? But first, with Thanksgiving around the corner here, I want to take a moment to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to what I have to share. And it's my hope that you're able to take it far and beyond what I've been able to do to improve your life and the lives of others. It's the hope of every teacher that the student surpasses him. Or it should be. Otherwise, what's the point in teaching? And being on the verge of 200 subscribers now is just wow. So, thank you. I do try to respond to each and every message that I get. I've gotten more than a few asking about the Holy Guardian Angel. And yes, we will get to that. But we have to go through certain things first. I mean, if you really want to be technical about it, this entire series has been priming for just that. One needs to learn how to communicate effectively with the subconscious to effectively communicate with the HGA. Okay? Now, I'm still figuring out the whole Google Plus thing, so I know there's been messages sent to me on there. Just bear with me until I get it figured out. But I appreciate all the kind words. Thank you. Now, we have a lot to get into, so let's get into it. Most people would be surprised to learn that most everything in society is based upon astrology and occultism. But it's hidden in plain sight. For example, the days of the week are named after the planets, the 7 traditional planets. The old gods have never truly gone away. They're just ruling from behind the scenes. There'll be more examples as we go. What one needs to understand in astrology is that the planets don't just correspond to the celestial spherical objects in the sky that you see, but they also correspond to certain aspects of the human psyche within the subconscious mind. For example, anytime that you get angry, you're invoking an aspect of Mars. Anytime you feel love, you're invoking an aspect of Venus. And so what you learn in astrology is that you hear the sayings that we're all one, or nobody's cut from a different cloth. Well, that's true. It's always the same 7 players over and over again, in every story, mythological or modern, in all your interactions, your states of mind. The difference is where the planets are placed in someone's chart and how they aspect other planets, because some planets play nice with each other and some do not. Everyone has the same planets, the same signs, and the same houses in their chart. It's just that the positioning is different. Now, I previously said I would tell you about an easy method to learn astrology that I use personally. And this method is the keyword method. And it's simply keeping track of the keywords of correspondences to planets, signs, and houses. The astrology books will give you your starter correspondences. But you're always going to learn more as you go. And so it's necessary to write them down. After a while, you just know them. The book 777 by Aleister Crowley is an encyclopedia of correspondences. And if someone ever wondered why we use certain plants and herbs in our magic rituals, it's for their planetary and astrological correspondences. These things have a certain frequency and vibration to them, when we get in the law of vibration, that resonates with the planets and the subconscious psyche of people. So let's just take one of the planets now, and we're going to take the granddaddy of them all, And we're going to be talking about Saturn. Saturn gets a bad rap in astrology, and it's only half deserved, because every planet has polarity to it as well. There's going to be a positive and a negative side to each of the planets. And Saturn is one of the planets that everybody seems to focus on the negative aspects of it. And it is a pretty negative planet. It corresponds with Binah, the Sephiroth Binah on the Tree of Life, which is on the negative pillar of severity. But Saturn is a necessary planet. And even more so than many magical practitioners may even know. Saturn is well known for representing limitations, obstacles, boundaries, the word no. And Saturn is the strict disciplinarian. Saturn takes things away. Saturn banishes and binds. Saturn rules over time and cycles. It's known as the planet of karma, at least the Western idea of karma. Saturn corresponds to dissolution and decomposition, and is known as the planet of death. Saturn's color is black. Saturn represents the father, authority figures, the boss. Saturn is cold and serious. Saturn governs patience, structure, and organization. So, let's go over these things a little bit in more detail. I'll try not to blow your minds too much. The limitations and obstacles and boundaries that Saturn represents and gets a bad rap for are necessary. For without limitations and boundaries, how can you differentiate between one thing and another? If there's no space between one thing and another, then there cannot be different things. There cannot be different structures. Saturn rules the physical realm. Every physical object has structure and is therefore bound by time. For there is no time in spirit. Only the physical is bound by time. Limitations and boundaries. Every magic circle that you step into, that circle is a Saturn circle. The circle differentiates between one space and another by the most efficient means possible. Saturn doesn't like to waste anything. Saturn rules cycles. It likes to recycle. It doesn't like to let anything go to waste. We all know that electricity flows from the positive terminal to the negative terminal. Saturn is that negative terminal when it comes to physicality. It's the final destination in the circuit of life, where Saturn will then recycle the energy. If it had a motto, it would be, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Saturn takes its job and duty very seriously. In fact, it rules over duties, obligations, and contracts. A contract is binding. There's your clue. Saturn binds things. All the other planets are within Saturn's orbit, within Saturn's circle, including Earth. One ring to rule them all.
One ring to rule them all. One ring to fight them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness, fight them.
Saturn binds and dominates. And so the circle is representative of cycles and boundaries. The planets themselves are spherical, which are three-dimensional circles. So everything in the physical is bound by time, which Saturn rules over time, father time. Saturn is that father figure. It's the boss. It's the boss that nobody likes because it has the dirty job of having to break down physicality at the end of its cycle. It gets a bad rap for death. However, Saturn only rules natural deaths. when things have reached their time and their natural cycle. Mars is the killer. Mars is the murderer and rules over accidents and violence. Mars gets a bad rap too. We'll get to Mars a little later. But these cycles and boundaries are necessary for the existence of physical reality. If you want to appease Saturn, you have to look at death and the endings of cycles as something necessary and beautiful. You have to be grateful for your limitations and obstacles as well. That they provide you a challenge to, if everything was really easy, it would be boring. How could you have success without there being a boundary between one space and the next? A line to cross. And because Saturn rules these things and structure, boundaries and structure, it's really, really key on physical structure. Organization and structure should be the first things you consider in anything that you're doing. You got to get organized. Saturn's the first planet you need to make sure you have on your side. You look at the homes of any of the elite, and their homes are very well organized and structured. Compare that to somebody's whose is very disorganized, with a bunch of clutter. We talked about how a cluttered home and environment is evidence of a cluttered mind, a cluttered subconscious. How are you going to have things getting through and have communication with your subconscious if everything's cluttered? Saturn is the heaviest of all the planets. Its metal is lead. The densest, heaviest metal there is. It's so dense that even radiation cannot go through it. You know why heavy metal is the hardest music? It's dealing with Saturn and Mars. If you get into black metal, that's strictly Saturn. That's the heaviest you can get. See, in Christianity, they turned Saturn into Satan. And Mars, the red planet, was turned into the devil. People who are practicing Satanism are working with Mars and Saturn almost exclusively. This is where black magic is derived from Saturn. And, way earlier in the series I was talking about you don't want to fall into this black magic versus white magic trapping, because that's like taking only the sun sign in a horoscope into account and ignoring the rest of the chart. That's coming from a polarized perspective. Yes, Saturn and Mars can be used for destructive purposes. And baneful magic almost exclusively uses Saturn and Mars. That's why those planets are known as the malefics. Saturn being the greater and Mars being the lesser. But as I was saying, there's also positive aspects to each planet. And Saturn can be used to bind and banish those obstacles and limitations in your life as well. Banish poverty. If you're poor, strapped for cash, and because it's a negative flow, okay? We talked about positive and negative being projective and receptive. Projection and receptive. It's a push or pull. If you're having trouble attracting things, pulling things towards you, try pushing what the other stuff away. If you have trouble drawing money to you, well, push poverty away. Maybe you're better at the push than you are at the pull due to your own energetic makeup. The keys to your power and abilities are going to be found within your chart. And we got to find out what you're good at as we're going over this stuff. So people look at death as this terrible thing, and Saturn gets a bad rap for it. But here's the thing. Saturn destroys to stave off larger destruction. Because if it didn't break down the energy and recycle it, the entire circuit would back up. What happens if things stay in the line? It will back up the circuit, and therefore short circuit the entire thing. What happens if your kidneys fail and you cannot relieve yourself? Your entire system backs up and you'll die. And that's with any circuit or line. There's got to be an input and an output. And so it's a necessary evil, although it's not evil. Okay? It's a necessary job. It's the dirty job that nobody wants to do, and Saturn's the one that has the duty and obligation and takes it very seriously to do it. That's why it comes off as very cold and unemotional. Saturn and Mars are the villains in every single movie or story. Well, occasionally Mercury. You know, Mercury goes retrograde and it becomes the trickster. Loki in the Thor movies is actually Mercury. Okay? Although in the first one he was great because he was real deceptive. But in the Avengers, no, they just made him just like mean. They made him more like Mars, and it just ruined the whole thing. It just was not in character. But that's a sidetrack. But typically, the villains in movies will be wearing black or red or a combination thereof. Not every time, but most. You know, think of Darth Vader. Darth Maul. I just watched the Man of Steel movie not that long ago, and it had, Zod was wearing black. You know, they all wear black and red. And in movies, if there's more than one villain, you know, the main villain will always be Saturn. It will be always the most organized. It will be the boss villain. The more calculated one. You'll have to go through his all his henchmen to get to him. You know, he's always the last one because he's the outermost ring. And we're gonna start getting into some of these archetypes a bit later on, and why you should not take on the villain or supervillain persona, because that's what you're doing when you're doing like baneful magic, is you're taking on the supervillain archetype. And the subconscious already knows that the supervillain always loses. Okay, it may work out for a while, but we'll get into that, and I'll explain all that. So Saturn's function and duty to destroy, to prevent further destruction, gives us the ability to banish our own obstacles, things that are preventing us from moving forward. The very things our own psyche, our own Saturn, have put in place to limit us. Self-limiting beliefs. Because at first it seems paradoxical to destroy to prevent further destruction, but I'm hoping you have a better understanding of that now. But Saturn also wants you to work hard and be disciplined about it. Here's another correspondence for you. Saturn is the 7th planet. Okay? And we know that it rules cycles, and 7 is the number of completion. Saturn is exalted in the 7th sign of Libra. And Libra is ruled by Venus, which corresponds with the 7th Sephiroth of Netzach on the Tree of Life. The numbers 3 and 7 have strong associations with Saturn. Now, why in the world would the planet associated with death and dissolution be exalted in the sign of relationships? And I'm just going to go ahead and give you a $1 million occult secret right now to you artists, musicians, and writers out there. If you want to have a hit, you need to write about a planet in exaltation. Okay? Blue Oyster Cult, their biggest hit today, Don't Fear the Reaper, is all about Saturn and Libra. Every action movie is where it's, the one that has to save the day, the sun save the day, is Sun in Aries, Sun exalted in Aries. So there's a big occult secret right there. You can use it, but you need to do it in the right way by actually honoring the planets, because they are exalted in that sign. They like their story to be told, but they want to be exalted in you telling it and honoring them, okay? Do it for their exaltation, not your own, if you want to have success in that. It's the same players on every stage, but it's how the story is told and what the attention is that determines successful or unsuccessful. But back to how Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra. And that's marriage. Till death do we part. The wedding ring on the finger that binds you now to your partner by way of a marriage license or contract that now gives you certain duties and obligations and responsibilities to fulfill. And you also now have certain limitations imposed upon you. You're probably not going to be able to stay out until 4 in the morning while your partner waits at home and have a successful marriage. Saturn doesn't like the idea of an open marriage. Saturn is a traditionalist. He's a very old school guy. Now, Libra being the sign of balance and justice is why you see the judges in courts wearing black robes, and why the law is heavily based on contracts. And we'll get to that down the road. It's also why when Saturn was in Libra, we heard so much about gay marriage and equality in marriage. So that's Saturn in Libra. That's just the touch of it. And you can see how these things are right in front of your face, and yet nobody sees them. When I told you that there's just so much to this, I wasn't kidding. Now, Saturn's day is Saturday, and that's why it is the Jewish Sabbath. Christians' Sabbath day is Sunday. Christians are all about the sun. Judaism is all about Saturn, the Father and the Son. And no, I'm not kidding. Saturn and the Sun are polar opposites. One's cold, one's hot. One has the outermost orbit, one's directly in the center. One's Old Testament, one's New Testament. As you ever read the Bible and you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, you wonder why they're so completely different? That's why. The Old Testament had a very cold, wrathful, and seemingly detached God, and the New Testament had a loving, caring, forgiving God. The Bible itself is a book of polarity. You know why it has so many contradictions. But it's also what makes it so powerful, because polarity's built right into it. More on that later. But the final thing I want to cover is Saturn is known as the Lord of Karma, or at least in the Western sense of karma. And that's because it rules cycles. You know, the whole what goes around comes around type of thing. But as we discussed previously, it's not really system of reward and punishment, so much as it is what you send out comes back, because it goes out, it gets recycled, and then it comes back. And it's important to look at it like that, because reward and punishment are polar opposites of the same thing. Okay? It's just a line. It depends on what you perceive to be a reward or punishment, because people have this need or desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain, when pleasure and pain are they themselves polar opposites of the same thing. There are some people who actually enjoy pain. So it's really about what you send out is recycled and then comes back to you through the circuit. It's not a reward or punishment system, as most people perceive it to be. Because as what is good for one may be bad for another, I mean, who's to say? It's all about the perception and perspective that one has. So that's pretty much what Saturn's about. You'll come across other correspondences as you go, and when you do, you write them down and you have them. The more correspondences you have and you write down, the better an astrologer you'll be. Starts with organization. Now, where Saturn falls in your chart, depending on the sign and the house, is where you're probably going to tend to have the most limitations and restrictions and obstacles imposed on you, or seemingly imposed on you. A lot of these things are imposed upon ourselves, but that's where people tend to have a lot of difficulty. And they're typically the areas where people want to say yes, and Saturn says no. And that's a big reason why Saturn gets such a bad rap in astrology. But see, it's those areas that we need to look at to begin to reorganize and restructure them. Saturn will demand hard work and discipline in those areas, and will make you work 7 times harder than everyone else for the same thing. You have Saturn in the second house, the money house, you're going to have to work 7 times harder for the same amount of money that somebody else would have to work without Saturn there, which is typically considered the worst place to have Saturn. But look at the other houses. What about Saturn in the third house of communication? What about Saturn in the fourth house of home and family? What about the fifth house of fun, romance, and children? The sixth house, health and service. Is there a good place to have Saturn? Well, we already talked about Libra in the 7th house of marriage and relationships, so there's that. And the 2 signs and houses that Saturn rules, which are Capricorn in the 10th house and Aquarius in the 11th house. But no matter where Saturn's placed, it's going to demand discipline and structure and hard work. And if you can do that, then the areas that seem to be the most limiting, now you become an authority in those areas. The boss, the godfather, pun intended. But most people don't know how to handle the heavy burden that Saturn demands of us. And so, most people consider him Satan. It's easy to see why with all the associations, sure. Saturn can be your greatest enemy or your greatest ally. It all depends on whether you could follow its very strict rule set, which most people can't because we naturally want to take the path of least resistance. But Saturn says, no, you have to work hard for this and stop just falling back on your habits until hard work and discipline and structure become your habits. That's when he becomes your ally. And the area in your chart where he is going to tell you where you need to work the hardest and need the most structure, and where you'll become an authority if you do so. And I think that will about do it on this lesson on the planet Saturn. And I don't mind taking extra time for the planet of time. Take care.